Hi everyone, welcome to our second module. In this module we are going to be talking about how to differentiate instruction, specifically in the area of reading. So as a result of Common Core and in the addition of the 21st century skill set, we are seeing a lot more emphasis on cross-disciplinary skills. So students are being required to not just read, for example, in their English classes or read a passage and then answer questions, but they are being called upon to read more in-depth passages and word problems, say, for example, in math or in science. So there's a larger emphasis on subject matter vocabulary, as well as a larger emphasis on reading and reading comprehension across the board, rather just in that time of the day in which you are teaching reading skills, or that class such as English or literature, where you're focusing on those skills specifically. So in a moment, what I'm going to do is share my screen and you will see the PowerPoint for this week rather than me, and I will narrate what you see on the PowerPoint and just kind of expand upon the bullet points there. So just hang on a second. So at this moment, you should now see the PowerPoint for this week for advanced provisions. So if you click on the second slide, you can see why is reading so important. And this is a great little quote. Obviously, reading is the foundation of underlying instruction and assessment in all content areas. When students can read well, it makes school much easier. And that may seem like a no-brainer, but a lot of times I think we tend to forget. I hear a lot of educators say, well, I teach math or I teach science. In reality, we are all reading teachers. We are all English teachers. So regardless of the subject matter, it's very important that you know some of the basics on how to help students develop sharper reading skills, regardless of the content area in which you teach. So let's talk about some of the accommodations that we can give students with diverse learning needs in the area of reading. So when it comes to accommodations, the word accommodation is often used interchangeably with modifications, and that is incorrect. Accommodations do not alter the curriculum in any way, whereas a modification does. So accommodations help students access the curriculum without necessarily having to change the curriculum. So for example, an example of an accommodation, let's say you give your students 10 minutes to read a passage for a student with a specific learning disability in the area of reading comprehension. You may end up giving that particular student 20 minutes to read the passage. So you're not changing the passage itself, you're just allowing that student more time. That is an example of an accommodation. So when accommodations are being designed and implemented appropriately, what happens is that we level the playing field between students that have an exceptionality with their non-disabled peers. And a lot of times I may hear educators say, well, it's not exactly fair that one student receives this accommodation over another. What we have to do is make sure and realize that all of our students are unique, and we need to tailor instruction so that way every student can access the content appropriately. Accommodations, secondly, should be designed to remove barriers to learning material and demonstrating mastery of concepts. So, like I said, allowing extra time or allowing the student a quiet area in which to read. Those are examples of accommodations that can definitely help the student access the material and reach the lesson plan's objectives. The third aspect of an accommodation is the presence of accommodations do not fundamentally lower expectations or standards. You're still maintaining the same standards for these students. What we're doing though is just providing some additional supports so that they can reach those goals that we have set for them. So accommodations are essentially made in order to provide a student with a disability to equal access to learning and equal opportunities. So essentially, if you remember back to, for example, Special Education 101, what we're talking about we're referring to least restrictive environment and faith, free and appropriate education. We want to make sure, for example, that we are including all aspects of IDEA. And providing students with accommodations are all part of that. So what are some of the challenges associated with providing students with accommodations in reading? Well, one is that students tend to have a very diverse skill set. So for example, one student's strength in reading, it could be completely different from another one. Another student's need in an area of reading could be completely different than another one. So one student may struggle with reading comprehension, whereas another student may struggle with fluency. Another student may struggle with word attack or have difficulty with sight words. So what you have to do is look at the student's area of need and build on their strengths to address the need. So if, for example, students are struggling with subject matter vocabulary and that's affecting their reading comprehension, it's going to be important to front load the lesson with reviewing subject matter vocabulary. That way, when they go to read subsequent sections or passages or chapters, they will have an idea of what those key vocabulary words mean, and it's going to help them understand the material much better. So some of the areas that students may struggle with in terms of reading can be decoding. So some of those word attack skills and just kind of breaking words apart using those phonetic skills that students learn. Another one could be in working memory. So this is often associated with processing. So as many of you may have learned in a brain-based teaching class, working memory is limited. It has limited duration and capacity. So in other words, overloading students with too much too soon in a short period of time, there's a very small chance that a lot of information will transfer into long-term memory. So we have to make sure and chunk our tasks in all areas, but especially in the area of reading if we're dealing with students that struggle in this area. Processing text kind of goes along with that as well. General word and knowledge and recognition skills. Having prior knowledge about a particular subject can affect reading. So again, that's why it's important to start off those lessons with accessing prior knowledge, making sure that students have a basis or some type of history upon which they can draw or maybe create a relationship between what they are going to read and something that they've experienced in the past. That can really help with comprehension. Metacognitive skills. Metacognition is knowing that you know. So encouraging students and developing those skills in students that call upon them to say, okay, do I remember or do I understand what I just read? Or, oh, okay, that word I've never seen before, so I should look it up in a dictionary or I should look it up online. So metacognitive skills are incredibly important because they help the student determine what he or she feels that they know and what he or she feels as though may still be confusing to them or may still be unknown and maybe they need to ask some additional questions. Motivation and interest is another factor that affects reading. Obviously, if a student is very highly motivated academically, that tends to really help. However, if reading is difficult for a student, motivation to read is typically challenged in this area. Interest in the subject affects this as well. So if students are being asked to read stories that are interesting to them and related to their particular interests or hobbies that they enjoy, they're going to be much more motivated to engage in the lesson and the material itself. Language development is another factor. So you will have students, for example, that may have a specific learning disability in the area of reading, but may also be an English language learner. So that can affect reading development. Or you may have a student that has a language disorder in conjunction with a specific learning disability in reading or reading comprehension. So those are all factors that need to be considered and that will affect accommodations. Okay, now this is just a very brief review of a least restrictive environment. So again, this is all part of IDEA. So that's again review from like the special education 101 courses that you've already taken and all the materials in which you've read. But the reason why accommodations are so important is because they are consistent with educating students with disabilities in the least restrictive environment possible. Keep in mind if a student has an IEP and there will be accommodations and modifications outlined for you, it is not the choice of the teacher to implement them. They must be implemented legally. So it's very important that when you have a student with special needs in your class, that you review his or her IEP, pay close attention to not only their needs, their services, as well as their accommodations and modifications, and then make sure that they are implemented. If you ever have any questions about them or how to go about the implementation process, make sure that you reach out to the education specialist or program specialist on staff or in the district. So what are some of the things that accommodations address? First of all, input and output. So this is a method that is used by the student to demonstrate mastery. So we can accommodate students by, for example, using multiple or a variety of instructional modalities. How we present material is can be considered an accommodation. As a result, how students can demonstrate that they've mastered the material, that too can be accommodated for. So for example, giving students options in which they show you how they understand the material is kind of nice. So rather than just mandating that they write on a piece of paper the answer to a question, maybe giving them the option to verbally answer the question or answer your questions in an art form, or using film of some sort. So giving them options in terms of how they prove competency is a nice accommodation. Time and scheduling is another common accommodation. So maybe allowing certain students that have challenges in a particular area, extended time to complete a task is a very common accommodation. Quantity. If we reduce the work product, this borders on and consists more of a modification. However, again, it depends on how much you're altering, how much you're reducing, because that would then enter the area of a modification, which may be appropriate too. Again, you need to look at each student's IEP to determine what that student is supposed to receive in terms of support. Difficulty. So for example, if task difficulty is changed slightly but not significantly, that too is a very common accommodation. So again, another way that you can address difficulty is by allowing students to use their strengths to answer or address certain questions or meet certain standards. And then the task does not seem as difficult because they are using their strengths to address the lesson objectives rather than their areas of need. Another common accommodation is alternative settings. So let's say, for example, you have a student with a specific learning disability who, when she goes to take an assessment, she gets incredibly nervous, very, very anxious. She may have the option of, say, testing in a quiet environment outside of the classroom or in another area, so that way she does not have to experience as much anxiety that she feels watching her peers finish the tasks ahead of her, or maybe being disrupted by noises within the classroom. So that's another common accommodation that you will see. So in conclusion, when considering or contemplating what accommodations are necessary for the student, the nice thing about this is that many of these are already going to be designated for you. If a student has an individual education plan, you will actually be able to flip through the IEP in conjunction or along with the education specialist and see the list of accommodations and modifications that that student is to receive. But this kind of gives you an idea of how education specialists come up with accommodations and modifications for students. They obviously look at the areas of difficulty for the students. They want to know specifics, or we look at specifics about the student's disability and look at particular aspects of content or instruction that could be more challenging, and how can we accommodate for that. We start with the least restrictive environment accommodation first. So again, the goal is to keep students in class with non-disabled peers as much as possible. So by creating and implementing appropriate accommodations in the general education classroom, we are definitely consistent with IDEA principles. We also base decisions on implementing accommodations on data and data collection and analysis. So in other words, accommodations and modifications are not just chosen at random. Oftentimes education specialists and teachers, they will collect qualitative and quantitative data, and that will determine the areas of strength for the student as well as the areas of need, and subsequent accommodations and modifications can be developed. Okay, so this concludes common accommodations for reading. I hope that all of you enjoyed the module for this week, and please feel free to email us if you have any questions. Let's see here, let me close this. Okay, all right, so let me know if you have any questions, and I will see all of you online.